6:14 a.m., April 9th, 2026, Memphis, Tennessee. 41 federal agents moved through the pre-dawn quiet of Shelby County in 17 vehicles. No lights, no sirens, 9 destinations, 1 window. Estimated value of unregistered weapons inventory, $52 million. The vehicles split at Poplar Avenue and Germantown Parkway. 2 teams broke east toward Bartlett. 3 pushed south toward South Haven, Mississippi. The remaining 12 fanned across the outer ring of Memphis suburbs, each targeting a location that, on paper, looked like an ordinary place of business. Inside one of the lead vehicles, ATF Special Agent Diane Harlow checked her radio. 9 simultaneous warrants, 14 arrest targets. 1 morning to execute all of it before the network could react. The operation had a name, Operation Ledger. It had taken 15 months to build. What investigators found inside those 9 locations, and inside a machine shop 40 minutes south in Mississippi, confirmed something federal firearms regulators had suspected for years. That illegal business could run as a nearly invisible weapons pipeline. That compliance paperwork, properly manipulated, could hide 1,400 untraceable firearms moving across 7 states. And that the entire operation could be documented in precise handwritten detail in a single physical ledger recovered from a storage unit by agents who were looking for something else entirely. The ledger had been sitting in federal custody for 63 days before anyone understood what it was. This is what happened when they figured it out. Federal firearms compliance is straightforward on paper. Every licensed dealer, every pawn shop, every gun store, every online retailer with an FFL must maintain a bound book, an acquisition and disposition record. Every firearm that enters inventory gets logged. Every firearm that leaves gets logged. The serial number, the make and model, the buyer's information, the 4,473 form, the NICS background check result. The system works because it creates a paper trail, not a perfect one, but enough that, in theory, a federal agent can walk into any licensed dealer in the country and trace any weapon in inventory back to its manufacturer and forward to its most recent purchaser. In theory. What the system was not designed to catch was a network that maintained perfect surface compliance while running a completely separate inventory underneath. Marcus Del Rey hadn't built the network overnight. He had spent 11 years working inside the pawn industry before opening his first location in 2019. He understood the compliance architecture because he had lived inside it. He knew exactly how ATF inspections worked, what agents looked for, what they ignored, how much latitude the bound book requirement actually gave when implemented correctly. He opened his first shop in Cordova, Tennessee, in spring 2019. By the end of 2021, he had 4 locations. By late 2023, 9. All licensed, all compliant on paper, all sharing a single bound book custodian. A detail that, in isolation, raised no flags. Unusual, but not prohibited. A corporate entity could designate 1 compliance officer across multiple locations. In practice, it meant 1 person controlled all 9 sets of records. His name was Trevor Wills, 44 years old, former bookkeeper, no prior criminal history. He drove between locations twice a month, reviewed compliance submissions, and filed quarterly reports to ATF's Industry Operations Division. The reports were clean. They were also, investigators would later determine, largely fabricated. The detail that broke the case didn't come from ATF. It came from a retired ATF analyst named Gerald Pruitt, who had spent 22 years in federal firearms enforcement before taking a consulting contract with a private compliance monitoring firm in late 2025. Pruitt's job was data pattern analysis, reviewing the federal firearms licensee database on behalf of insurance underwriters who wanted early warning indicators of compliance risk in dealer networks they covered. He was 61 years old. He had reviewed thousands of compliance submissions over 2 decades. He knew what real pawn shop records looked like. Real pawn shop records are messy. Acquisitions come in unpredictably, whatever customers bring through the door. Different makes, different models, different conditions. The distribution of serial numbers across manufacturers follows no pattern. Return rates fluctuate. Hold periods vary. The records of a functioning pawn shop firearms section look, statistically, like organized noise. In late October 2025, Pruitt was reviewing quarterly submissions from a cluster of Tennessee-based dealers when he pulled up records for a 9-location group operating under the corporate name Riverside Pawn Holdings, LLC. He read through the first location's records, then the second, then the third. He stopped at the 4th. The acquisition patterns were identical across all 9 locations. Not similar, not comparable. Identical in structure, the same manufacturer distribution ratios, the same disposition timing, the same hold period averages. The kind of statistical match that couldn't occur naturally across 9 separate physical locations operating independently. Real pawn shops don't produce matching records. These 9 did. Pruitt flagged his concern in an internal memo, forwarded the submission set to his supervisor, and then, because he still had contacts at ATF's Nashville Field Division from his years in federal service, made a phone call. The call went to Special Agent in Charge, Patricia Lowery. She took the meeting. Going through Pruitt's original compliance analysis, one figure kept coming back. The return rate on firearms held over 60 days. The percentage of pawned weapons that customers never reclaimed was 1% across all 9 locations. Industry average for pawn shop firearms, between 18 and 24%. That number couldn't exist in a legitimate operation. Not across 9 locations. Not consistently, quarter after quarter. Either Riverside Pawn Holdings had found a way to make nearly every customer come back for their firearm, or the records weren't tracking the weapons actually moving through those locations. ATF's Nashville Field Division opened a formal investigation January 7, 2026. The case was designated Priority Level 2, significant resource allocation without the full deployment of an organized crime task force. 2 agents were assigned initially, Diane Harlow, 12 years with ATF, and her partner, Special Agent Kevin Marsh, who had spent 4 years with ATF's underground pipeline unit before transferring to Nashville. Their first priority was surveillance. Before any undercover activity, before any controlled purchases, they needed to understand how the locations operated day to day, what vehicles came and went, what patterns existed in deliveries and pickups, who visited multiple locations in sequence. The surveillance ran 3 weeks before the first pattern emerged. A white Ford Transit van with Arkansas plates made stops at 4 of the 9 Riverside Pawn locations over a 2-day period in mid-January. The driver, a man in his mid-40s identified from surveillance footage, visited the back entrance loading areas of each location, not the customer entrance, the loading area. The van was registered to a company called Ozark Parts Distribution, based in Fayetteville, Arkansas. Harlow ran Ozark Parts through standard databases. The company had an FFL, a Type 01 dealer license. It had been operating since 2018. Its compliance record was clean, but its purchase history, pulled through federal firearms transaction records, told a different story. Over the preceding 18 months, Ozark Parts had purchased approximately 3,400 AR pistol lower receivers, the serialized component that legally constitutes a firearm, from 3 different manufacturers. It had also purchased, in quantities that vastly exceeded any retail justification, a category of item that required no federal serialization at all: 80% lowers. Polymer and aluminum blocks machined to within 20% of being a functional firearm receiver. Legal to purchase without background checks. Legal to sell. Legal to own. Not legally a firearm until that final 20% of machining was completed. Ozark Parts had purchased 80% lowers from 6 different suppliers over 18 months. Total volume, approximately 4,800 units, for a small parts distributor serving the retail market. There was no retail market that could absorb that volume legitimately. Harlow flagged the Ozark connection to SAC Lowery on January 31st. The investigation expanded. A 3rd agent joined the team, Special Agent Anton Reyes, who had background in financial crimes investigation and would track the money side of the operation while Harlow and Marsh focused on the physical supply chain. What Reyes found over the following 3 weeks confirmed that Ozark Parts Distribution was not just a supplier to the Riverside Pawn Network. It was the source node. The structure worked in stages. Ozark Parts purchased 80% lowers from multiple suppliers, keeping individual orders below thresholds that would trigger enhanced review. The materials moved from Arkansas to a rented machine shop in South Haven, Mississippi, a 200-square-foot industrial unit on Commerce Drive, leased by a holding company with no obvious connection to Delray or Riverside Pawn. Inside the South Haven shop, the 80% lowers were finished. The remaining 20% of machining that converted them from legal raw material into functional firearm receivers, combined with commercially available parts kits, upper assemblies, barrels, triggers. The finished products were functional, untraceable firearms with no serial numbers. Ghost weapons, in the language of federal firearms enforcement. The weapons moved from South Haven into the Riverside Pawn Network through the back-channel delivery system Harlow had observed. They entered inventory without being logged in the bound books. They were sold to customers. In cash, without 4,473 forms, without background checks, at prices significantly below what a comparable serialized weapon would cost. The official bound books showed none of it. What they showed instead was a precisely managed set of legitimate firearms transactions, real weapons, real buyers, real paperwork, that created the appearance of a functioning, compliant operation while the real inventory moved entirely off-book underneath. The most surprising part of this operation wasn't the scale. It was the discipline. Most firearms trafficking networks get caught because someone gets sloppy. One missing form, one cash transaction that doesn't match stated income, one buyer who gets arrested with a traced weapon. Delray's network had operated for 36 months with near zero forensic signature. On February 12, 2026, ATF authorized controlled purchases at 4 of the 9 Riverside Pawn locations. Undercover agents made separate visits to the Cordova, Bartlett, Collierville, and Germantown locations over a 2-week period. In each case, they initiated contact through the back entrance, approaching employees using language consistent with knowledge of the off-book system. Cash transactions only. No forms. At each of the 4 locations, they were sold functional, semi-automatic pistols with no serial numbers. No 4,473 filed. No background check conducted. Straight cash. 4 locations. 4 purchases. All documented. The controlled purchases gave Harlow's team what they needed to support warrant applications. But they also revealed something unexpected. At the Bartlett location, the undercover agent was told by the employee handling the transaction that the price list had just changed. New shipment. Better product. The employee used a phrase the agent noted verbatim in their debrief. Fresh off the press from down south. Down south. South Haven. The South Haven machine shop had not yet been connected to the pawn network through physical evidence. Surveillance had established the Ozark Parts connection. Financial analysis had identified the holding company that leased the industrial unit. But the chain of physical proof linking the South Haven shop to the completed weapons entering the Memphis locations was still circumstantial. That phrase changed the calculus. Here's the part that doesn't make sense on the surface. ATF had 4 controlled purchases, a documented supply chain, financial records connecting Ozark Parts to the South Haven shop, and surveillance footage of the delivery runs. That should have been enough. But Harlow knew what happened to cases like this at trial without a direct link between the manufacturing site and the finished product entering retail locations. Defense attorneys had broken similar prosecutions on exactly that gap. Physical evidence, not circumstantial chains. Physical evidence a jury could hold. They needed something inside the South Haven shop. The obstacle was timing. The shop appeared to operate on an irregular schedule, active for periods of several days, then dark for a week or more. Getting inside without detection required either a technical surveillance installation or an inside asset. Technical installation risked discovery if the shop's operators swept for equipment. An inside asset required time they weren't sure they had. ATF's solution was a joint approach. They requested DEA assistance, not because narcotics were involved, but because DEA maintained a network of confidential informants in the South Haven industrial corridor from an unrelated distribution case. One of those informants had legitimate business reason to be in the Commerce Drive area. The informant was tasked with a narrow objective: document any exterior vehicle movement around the Commerce Drive facility over a 2-week period. License plates, times, physical descriptions of materials being moved. The informant came back with something they hadn't expected. On the afternoon of February 24th, the informant observed 2 individuals loading cardboard boxes into the back of a pickup truck registered to Trevor Wills, the bound book custodian for the entire Riverside Pawn network. The boxes weren't opened, but their size and weight, as the informant described them, were consistent with firearm components. Wills connecting directly to the South Haven shop wasn't something the investigation had anticipated. He was understood to be the compliance manager, the paperwork layer. Finding him physically present at the manufacturing facility meant either that his role was more operational than investigators had assumed, or that the operation was in a phase change, possibly preparing to move inventory or shut down. SAC Lowery escalated the case on March 1st. US Marshals service was brought in, not for fugitive apprehension, but for operational support in multi-target simultaneous warrant executions. With 9 locations plus the South Haven shop, ATF's Nashville Field Division didn't have the manpower to execute all warrants in a single window without external support. A coordinated operation date was set tentatively for mid-April. Then the ledger surfaced. On February 7th, 5 weeks before the South Haven connection was confirmed, 6 weeks before the operation date was set, a US Marshals fugitive apprehension team executing an unrelated warrant in Shelby County opened a storage unit registered to a known associate of their target. The target wasn't there, but the storage unit contained a cardboard box with a combination lock. Standard procedure. Box gets logged as potential evidence, transported to a federal facility for processing once a warrant is obtained. The warrant for the storage unit contents was obtained February 19th. The box was opened. Inside, financial records, handwritten ledgers, and a spiral-bound notebook. The processing agent noted the contents as potentially relevant to an ongoing financial investigation and forwarded a summary to ATF's Industry Operations Division, because the notebook appeared to contain firearms transaction records. Industry Operations cross-referenced the location names in the notebook against active investigations. The cross-reference returned a match on March 4th. Harlow was notified the same afternoon. She drove to the federal facility in Nashville the following morning and spent 4 hours with the notebook and the handwritten ledgers. What she was reading was a 2-year off-book sales record for the entire Riverside Pawn network. One detail that stuck out, going through the case documents: the ledger wasn't encrypted, wasn't coded, wasn't written in any way designed to obscure what it was. It was a straightforward double-entry accounting system applied to illegal firearms transactions. Date, location, weapon description, price, cash received. The same format you'd see in any small business ledger. That suggested either extraordinary confidence that the ledger would never be found, or the kind of institutional habit that develops in operations that have been running without interference long enough that basic operational security starts to feel unnecessary. The ledger covered February 2024 through January 2026. 23 months of transactions across all 9 locations. Total transactions recorded, 1,412. Total cash value recorded, $51, $8 million, rounded to $52 million in subsequent federal filings. The weapons logged ranged from basic pistol configurations to finished AR platform rifles, all listed without serial numbers, all listed as cash transactions. Buyer information was recorded only by a 2-letter location code. Investigators interpreted these as staff codes identifying which employee processed each sale, not buyer identification. The ledger did not tell them where the money went after it was collected. That was a separate thread, but it fundamentally changed the prosecution posture of the case. Before the ledger, federal prosecutors were building around controlled purchases and a documented supply chain. Solid, but potentially limited to the 4 locations where undercover buys had occurred. The ledger implicated all 9 locations and provided a total scale that elevated every charge from weapons violations to conspiracy and organized criminal enterprise. More significantly, the ledger identified a category of transaction beginning in September 2025, labeled with a notation Harlow didn't recognize immediately. It took 2 hours and a call to ATF's Industry Operations Intelligence Unit to decode. The notation referenced sales to what the ledger described as fleet buyers, customers purchasing multiple weapons in a single transaction. Between September 2025 and January 2026, the final 4 months covered by the ledger, fleet buyer transactions accounted for 31% of total volume. Fleet buyers in the legitimate firearms market means law enforcement agencies, security companies, or licensed dealers purchasing in quantity. In the off-book context, it meant something different. The weapons weren't going to individual buyers. A significant portion of the late-stage inventory was moving in bulk to unidentified downstream distributors, people taking multiple ghost weapons and moving them further, into secondary markets, into other states, potentially across jurisdictions the Memphis investigation hadn't mapped. 7 states, according to the original case synopsis. The ledger suggested the network was larger than investigators thought they understood. Worth saying plainly, the 3-year gap between when this operation started and when it was caught is a failure of the compliance inspection system, not just the ambition of one criminal network. ATF's Industry Operations Division is chronically understaffed relative to the number of FFL holders it oversees. A network of 9 locations filing clean paperwork falls through the inspection gap because there's no capacity to do the kind of statistical pattern analysis that a retired consultant did as a secondary job function. That's a structural problem, not an individual failure. The operation date moved up. Originally set for April 16th, Lowery pushed it to April 9th after the ledger analysis identified the fleet buyer pattern. The concern was that if the network's downstream distributors became aware of the investigation, through any channel, they would accelerate movement of remaining inventory in ways that would be difficult to track. 14 arrest targets, 9 pawn locations, 1 machine shop in South Haven, 1 coordinated morning window. In the 3 weeks between the ledger analysis and the operation date, the investigation team worked through 2 significant complications. The first, the South Haven machine shop lease had lapsed on March 15th. The facility had gone dark. Surveillance confirmed no activity at the Commerce Drive address after March 18th. The equipment used to finish the 80% lowers had been moved. To where was unknown. This was the obstacle that came close to derailing the operation entirely. The South Haven shop was not just an arrest target. It was the primary evidence target for the manufacturing component of the case. Without the physical equipment, the conspiracy charge connecting Delray to the manufacturing process became significantly harder to prove. Reyes traced the lease termination through holding company records and identified a secondary address, a smaller warehouse in Olive Branch, Mississippi, 15 miles from the original South Haven location. The new lease had been signed February 28th in the name of a different holding company with no documented connection to Delray or Riverside Pawn. The connection came through a phone number. A cell number used to sign off on the Olive Branch lease paperwork appeared in records associated with one of the 14 arrest targets, a man named Calvin Pruitt, unrelated to the retired ATF analyst, who operated as the logistics coordinator between Ozark Parts and the Memphis locations. The warrant application was amended to include the Olive Branch address. The second complication arrived 6 days before the operation. Trevor Wills, the bound book custodian, the compliance manager, the man whose truck had been spotted at the South Haven shop, filed a change of address form with ATF's Industry Operations Division on April 3rd, listing a new home address in Hernando, Mississippi. It might have been routine. People move. It also might have been someone repositioning themselves ahead of something they knew was coming. Harlow flagged the address change to SAC Lowery immediately. Lowery contacted the US Marshals Fugitive Unit, the same team that had found the storage unit, and requested passive surveillance on Wills's new Hernando address through the operation date. Surveillance confirmed Wills was present at the Hernando address on April 7th and 8th. On the morning of April 9th, Wills was on the arrest target list with a confirmed location. The operation brief at 4:30 a.m. covered 17 entry teams across 10 locations. Each team had a designated entry point, a designated evidence collection priority, and a communications protocol that funneled all field updates through a single tactical operations center in a conference room at the ATF Nashville Field Division office. Harlow commanded the operation from that room. At 6:14 a.m., all teams confirmed ready. At 6:17 a.m., Harlow gave the execute order. What do you think? Did the compliance inspection system fail the public years before this network was ever discovered? Or is this an acceptable trade-off given enforcement resource constraints? That's a real question, not a rhetorical one. The gap between when Riverside Pawn opened in 2019 and when a retired consultant flagged the pattern in 2025 is 6 years. At the Cordova location, the original Riverside Pawn shop, Delray's first, the entry team reached the front and rear simultaneously. 2 agents went through the front entrance. 3 covered the rear loading area. Delray was not present. His arrest was assigned to a separate vehicle team tracking his personal vehicle from his Germantown residence. At 6:23 a.m., Delray's vehicle was stopped on Poplar Avenue. He was taken into custody without incident. He said nothing. At the Bartlett location, the entry team found the store manager attempting to access the office safe. The safe was secured before it could be opened. Its contents, recovered under warrant, included $214,000 in cash and 4 ghost weapons, not logged in any record. Not in the bound book, not in the ledger. At the Germantown location, the team found 3 employees present and a customer who had apparently arrived before the business opened, waiting in the parking lot. The customer was detained for questioning and released. He was not charged. At the South Haven address on Commerce Drive, the team found the building empty, consistent with surveillance indicating operations had moved to Olive Branch. The team documented the space and withdrew. The Olive Branch team reached the warehouse on Craft Road at 6:31 a.m., delayed by 14 minutes due to a wrong turn on county roads in the pre-dawn darkness that GPS hadn't corrected for accurately. The delay meant the Olive Branch entry happened after several other locations had already gone active. For 7 minutes, there was an open question in the Tactical Operations Center. Had the Olive Branch team reached the target before anyone inside could react to news of the other entries? The entry team confirmed breach at 6:38 a.m. Inside, 3 individuals, the finishing equipment, and approximately 340 partially completed lower receivers in various stages of machining. 2 of the 3 individuals were on the arrest target list. The third was a machinist, with no prior record, whose connection to the network was established during subsequent interviews. Trevor Wills was taken into custody at his Hernando address at 6:19 a.m. He was, according to the arresting agent's report, already awake and dressed when the team arrived. Whether that meant anything remained an open question. By 8:47 a.m., 13 of the 14 arrest targets were in federal custody. The 14th, identified in case documents only as the primary downstream distributor for the fleet buyer transactions, was not at his listed address and was not located that morning. He remained at large as of the date federal prosecutors filed the initial indictment. The operation had taken 2 hours and 30 minutes. 9 locations, 1 manufacturing site, 13 arrests, 17 search warrants executed. Evidence collected included the bound books from all 9 locations, point-of-sale system records, financial records, approximately $890,000 in cash across multiple locations, 67 ghost weapons recovered from various inventory locations, and the machining equipment from the Olive Branch warehouse. The ledger recovered from the storage unit, the one that had been sitting in federal custody for 63 days before the cross-reference identified it, was entered into evidence as the centerpiece of the prosecution's conspiracy case. Comment ledger if you want us to cover what happened in the federal proceedings in a follow-up. Federal prosecutors filed charges on April 14th against all 13 individuals in custody. Marcus Del Rey faced the full list: conspiracy to manufacture and deal in firearms without a license, unlicensed dealing in firearms, conspiracy to commit money laundering, and obstruction of federal firearms laws. The charges carried a combined potential sentence exceeding 40 years. Trevor Wills was charged with conspiracy, unlicensed dealing, and making false statements in required records. The last charge referencing the fabricated compliance submissions he had filed quarterly for 3 years. Calvin Pruitt, the logistics coordinator, entered proffer discussions with federal prosecutors within 72 hours of his arrest. What Pruitt told investigators during those sessions expanded the picture in 2 directions. The first, the fleet buyer network. The downstream distributors purchasing weapons in bulk during the final months of the operation were not, as investigators had initially assumed, local to the Memphis area. Pruitt described a buyer in Nashville, a buyer in Atlanta, and a buyer he knew only by a phone number who arranged shipments to an address in Charlotte, North Carolina. 7 states in the original case characterization may have been conservative. The second, the money. The $51. $8 million in transactions documented in the ledger had not moved through conventional banking channels, which explained why Reyes's financial analysis had not produced a clear money trail in the early stages of the investigation. Pruitt described a layering system involving cash businesses, bulk cash deliveries to intermediaries, and at least 1 cryptocurrency conversion step. The complete financial trail had not been mapped as of the indictment date. Harlow's team had 1 network dismantled and documented. They had a second network, the distribution layer, the downstream buyers, the financial pipeline, that remained partially visible. The 14th arrest target remained a fugitive. Here's the take that'll probably get pushback. The ghost weapons problem isn't primarily a manufacturing problem. It's a distribution problem. Finishing an 80% lower requires equipment, skill, and time. Moving the finished product through a compliant-looking retail front requires something harder to replicate: institutional knowledge of how federal oversight works and where its gaps are. Del Rey had that knowledge because he spent 11 years operating legitimately inside the system before he used it against the system. The enforcement gap isn't in detecting the manufacturing. It's in detecting the intelligence required to exploit the compliance architecture. Closing that gap means changing the architecture, not just adding enforcement resources. At the time of the indictment, federal prosecutors listed the estimated total value of off-book weapons inventory moved through the Riverside Pawn Network at $52 million. That figure was based on the ledger documentation. What it didn't account for was the fleet buyer volume, the bulk transactions in the final 4 months, where the downstream distribution network had moved product that the ledger recorded at wholesale prices, but which had likely been resold at significant markup into retail black markets across multiple states. The actual economic scale of the operation was larger than the figure in the indictment. By how much remained unclear. Of the 1,412 weapons recorded in the ledger, 67 had been recovered during the April 9th warrants. The machining equipment in Olive Branch accounted for an additional 340 units in various stages of completion. The remaining weapons, approximately 1,000 ghost firearms documented in the ledger as sold over a 36-month period, were in circulation somewhere across 7 states with no serial numbers, no registration, and no mechanism for systematic recovery. If you've ever tried to trace a firearm through the NICS system and hit a dead end because a record was incomplete, imagine that problem applied to 1,000 weapons that were never in the system to begin with. Subscribe if you want to follow the federal proceedings. The Delray trial date was set for November 2026, and the downstream distributor fugitive hunt is still active. Put yourself in Harlow's position for a moment. You've executed a successful multi-site warrant operation. You've made 13 arrests, you've secured the manufacturing evidence, you've recovered the ledger. By any operational measure, the morning of April 9th was a success. And you're also sitting with the knowledge that one target is still out there, that approximately 1,000 untraceable weapons are in circulation, that the financial trail is incomplete, and that at least 3 downstream buyers in Nashville, Atlanta, and Charlotte are aware that their supplier network just got dismantled. What happens next in those 3 cities is not something the Memphis operation controlled. Marcus Delray was held without bail pending trial. His attorney filed a motion challenging the admissibility of the ledger on the grounds that it was recovered in a search targeting a different individual, and that the connection to Delray had been established through a cross-reference process the defense characterized as speculative. The motion was denied. Trevor Wills agreed to cooperate with federal investigators in exchange for a reduced charge structure in late April. His cooperation included providing the financial account details for the cash layering operation that Reyes had been unable to map from external records. The cooperation agreement did not resolve the fugitive question. Wills stated under interview that he did not know the identity of the primary downstream distributor, that he had only ever communicated with that individual through an intermediary. The intermediary was Calvin Pruitt. Pruitt's proffer agreement was still under negotiation as of the filing date. The Ozark Parts operation in Fayetteville, Arkansas, was subject to separate federal proceedings. The owner, Raymond Colbert, 51 years old, no prior federal record, was arrested April 9th as part of the coordinated warrants and charged separately with conspiracy to supply materials for the unlicensed manufacture of firearms and with making false statements in required federal records. Colbert's attorney indicated he would contest the charges. The 80% lower suppliers who had sold bulk quantities to Ozark Parts were reviewed by ATF industry operations in the weeks following the arrests. The review identified no illegal activity on the supplier's part. The sales had been legal. The problem was not in the supply chain above Ozark Parts. It was in what Ozark Parts did with the material. The legal status of 80% lowers was unchanged by the case. They were not serialized. They were not regulated as firearms. The Riverside Pawn case had demonstrated in explicit detail exactly how they could be used in a sustained weapons manufacturing operation running beneath federal oversight. The demand that created Riverside Pawn still exists. The infrastructure that supplied it was broken. How long it takes for a replacement to form is the question the case leaves open. The network is dismantled. The ledger is in evidence. And somewhere in the inventory of 7 states, 1,000 untraceable weapons are waiting to surface. In a crime scene evidence log, a traffic stop, a ballistics match, a case that doesn't yet know it's connected to a machine shop in Olive Branch, Mississippi, and a pawn chain in the Memphis suburbs that filed clean paperwork for 3 years while something else entirely moved underneath it. 14 individuals charged, 13 in custody, 1 fugitive, $890,000 seized, 67 weapons recovered, a manufacturing operation dismantled, a compliance fraud documented in detail by the people who ran it, and a retired analyst who noticed that 9 pawn shops had records that were too clean.